Hey, my friends, before we begin, really quickly, 2 weeks ago, we finished up the Awake and Aware 2026 conference, and it exceeded all expectations. It was absolutely amazing. 32 people from disparate backgrounds by the middle of the second day were completely bonded in what I call the bubble, a place where things start to feel a little bit more possible. Change seems a easier proposition than it did before. And we formed a community, and we were learning about finding joy and awareness and meditation, contemplation, communication, and all sorts of amazing things. But beyond those fantastic topics, just the space and time we had created was something that as soon as the conference was over, I wanted to find again. And in service of that, we have already planned the dates for the 2027 conference. Now, the way we do this is in a Kickstarter style. So the Kickstarter is up now. And that means if within 2 weeks we get 18 people to sign up for the conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, February 21st through 24th, 2027, then the conference is a go. And if we don't, then we're not doing it. It's too impossible to set up conferences without knowing we have this foundational base. And to support those people signing up so early, the tickets are at cost. That is the lowest things could go because we're not going to go below cost. So this is the lowest tickets will ever be, is at cost if you sign up now. And once those 18 slots are gone, then the tickets will be significantly more expensive after that. So if this sounds at all intriguing, then just go to awakeawareconference.com. Awakeawareconference.com. All one word, awakeawareconference.com. Now let's get to the show. Hey folks, Scott Weingart here, and this is an EMCrit We. This is part 2 of the 3-part opioid adulterant / opioid issue podcast series that I've been doing. And the first episode we had was with Courtney Doherty on some of the adulterants she has been seeing in the Bronx, as well as the perspective of someone who actually deals with patients on the streets. Part 2, today, I have Arne Skolberg talking about the opioid chain of survival and then nitazenes as an adulterant. And then part 3 will be on Thursday, and I'll have a toxicologist talking about medetomidine as well as medetomidine withdrawal, which is probably the bigger issue. And that will, as far as I know, conclude my delving into opioids. Part 3 is really the true EMCrit, ED critical care, resuscitation / ICU type stuff. But these first 2 episodes that I've made we's, I've really enjoyed as well. And I think you'll really love the interview today. We spend the majority of the time talking about breeding compassion for opioid users and overdoses and the opioid chain of survival. And then we talk some about nitazenes as a new adulterant that's especially prevalent in Europe and Australia, but I'm sure it will come to the United States eventually. And then look forward for episode 3 on Thursday. So let's get right into the interview. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Arne Skolberg, and I'm a Norwegian critical care pre-hospital anesthesiologist and researcher based at the Oslo University Hospital.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, in your neck of the woods, the anesthesiologists generally are the pre-hospital physicians. So they're basically the equivalent of what in Australia would be the helicopter EMS docs. You folks run most of EMS, and surprisingly, in a lot of the environs around, you guys are actually running emergency medicine at many hospitals as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's changing a little bit, and there's hard to compare systems. We're definitely present in all areas where there are real emergency medicine with endangered physiology.
Absolutely. And you have a unique interest, it seems, based on all the publications and what you've been working on for the past decade, on opioids and their effects on patients and trying to keep them alive. Why is that an interest?
It started out with the research and development program in Norway, I guess 15 years ago, prior to all the approved nasal sprays of naloxone that were about. And my professor, Ola Dale, and our team set out to really create evidence-based medicine for vulnerable patients in a life-threatening conditions as well. And that's one thing led to another. And now I'm at the intersection between pharmacokinetics and dignity for patients, which I think is a really interesting place to be.
That's fantastic. And I think the way we'll phase this is we'll start off with some public health and then we'll zone in on real clinical issues for patients that they may be experiencing in the streets. So you have published a paper along with a number of esteemed co-authors on the chain of survival for opioid overdoses. Tell me a little bit about that.
First of all, I think we were the first to the printing press, but we're probably not the first people recognizing that treatment for opioid overdoses are in some way quite simple in terms of emergency medicine. There's an antidote available, there's a known pathology, there's recognizable symptoms and things like that. Yet we have this overdose crisis with people, first of all, dying a lot, and then also people presenting with repeat overdoses. And I think everyone working in their emergency services will recognize this. And there's, I think, also compassion fatigue almost among many EMS workers in a hopelessness with trying to solve this problem. And for everyone working in resuscitation, the chain of survival is such a recognizable concept, with recognizing that there are a set of actions that, if done in a timely fashion and in a certain order and to a certain evidence base, increase the likelihood of survival. Not only short term, but I think long term as well. The fact that in opioid overdoses, there's such disjointed services and there's disjointed parts of medicine and society that doesn't really talk to each other very much, or too little anyway. I think it's a concept that's worth exploring.
Yeah, and I'm happy to admit this now, but at the beginning part of my career, I really just had a active dislike for these opioid overdoses coming in. I felt they were wasting time, that this was not a good use of emergency medicine, that these people should just get their doses right and stop showing up in my emergency department. And now I look at this population with an immense amount of compassion, because if their lives were great, they would not generally be showing up in my emergency department with opioid overdoses. And so I guess the first question I'd have is, they don't want to overdose either. They have no desire to wake up to see my smiling face in front of them on a Friday night. Why are we getting so many opioid overdoses? If, first of all, you could take whichever parts of these questions first, and because it's going to be a kind of a mass, but I'm really curious about all of this. It would make sense to me for the dealer network to not want their users overdosing either, because the more of them that die, the less business they make. So they could, because it's not the street level dealers who are mixing this stuff, it's usually at a part in the chain higher up, they could just mix a fairly standardized set of batches. Like, this would not be hard chemistry to just give people what they want, which is very potent, but not so outlandishly more potent than they're used to that they would get a great high and not wind up overdosing. So give me a little bit of understanding about what's going on.
That was a very small question. I think on the one side, starting back from the end of your question, first of all, the human capacity for opioid tolerance is massive. So what's an overdose for one person is certainly a fatal overdose for another person. And not only is that between persons, but it's also in the same person over time. And it changes quite rapidly. I think the half-life of the tolerance is about 3 days. So you don't have to use drugs for a long time to become really tolerant. And we know this because in our surgical patients, and we don't talk enough about them to them, they will experience withdrawal after 1 week of normal prescription opioid use, this used as their doctor prescribed them. So this is very much a moving target in terms of both the therapeutic effect and the adverse events, with the overdose being the biggest adverse event. And then when we say there's a lot of opioid overdoses, of course, there's lots and lots of fatalities, and there's even more non-fatal events. But we actually don't know how big the use is. And remember, people use opioids for many years, every day, for years. In Norway, and you can argue we have heroin more than fentanyl, so it's a little bit different. But I think the average age of dying is 44, and the average age of a non-fatal event is 37, and people start in their 20s. So they have thousands of injections behind them before the fatal event. When this whole concept of there's lots of overdoses, from the epidemiological point of view, we actually don't know, because we don't know the true number of uses.
That's fascinating. I could see, no one wants to touch this because it's like admitting this problem's not going to go away. But if you made a standardized opioid unit right? Like you just said, one unit is this much. Then people would know my tolerance right now is 2.5, and they'd be in great shape. And obviously, we have no ability to actually legislate that, but it would just seem like street economics would lead them to some place where the users would have some idea of consistency between batches. But it seems like there's none of that. Do you have any insight into why that is?
No, I'm not sure you could because of the tolerance as well, and also because you don't know what's the point of taking the opioids in the first place. For most, you're now describing the sort of injection illicit drugs supply use, which is a huge part of it, of course. It's not ready to get high anymore. The party's over a few years ago for most of these patients. It's to keep the abstinence at bay. And of course, this is the whole rationale behind buprenorphine and methadone to get people to not become abstinent and then be able to take care of whatever underlying causes of the drug use there is. And then you have all the accidental exposures and all the prescription use gone wrong and everything. So it's much more complex than just a quote unquote junkie, as we would say in Europe, or a drug user. The population is much more varied as well in terms of their socioeconomic status and everything else.
That makes sense. So what would you like to see as this chain of survival? Tell me about each link and where we're falling short right now.
First of all, we need to recognize that we need a chain. We need to recognize the fact that these are people showing up in an emergency, and there was something before this event and there's something after the event. And of course, I think in any chain, you need to start with prevention. And one of the unique things with opioid overdoses is, unlike the cardiac arrest events, people are quite quick to call 911 and start CPR, or at least respond when someone falls down in the supermarket in a cardiac arrest event. Whereas the symptom recognition in overdoses, people need to be taught about that. And there's unique things then with the recognition and the basic first aid, in that there's so much antidote around in many communities, and take-home naloxone programs. And I'm afraid that the take-home naloxone programs, and indeed the whole treatment of opioid overdoses, is too reliant on naloxone. People think that, it's naloxone and everything is going to be fine. Hyponaloxonemia is not a problem. It's the hypoxemia. No one dies from the lack of naloxone. And I wonder if we have been missing an important mark, in that many people in their training with naloxone give naloxone and don't start CPR. So we get a lot of people who will receive naloxone who may not need it, and we get delayed start of cardiopulmonary resuscitation because people have been given the naloxone and they're just hanging around waiting to see the effect, when indeed they should have been starting compressions.
Now, in the States, we've really emphasized compression-only CPR for the lay public. Is that really going to do anything for an opioid overdose?
It's going to do a lot more than just giving the naloxone and stand looking at it. So ideally ventilation, of course, but the compression-only CPR, that's at least a physical stimulation. And I think you've been alluding to a really important article earlier in some of your podcasts, which is the Lavonis update on cardiac arrest in special circumstances. And there's two figures in there in the opioid chapter, and I call them the stone tablets, because they really have come down from the mountain to us, telling us how to do it. And it's about activating the EMS response and also physical stimulation of the patient. Physical stimulation is a potent opioid antagonist. And please start a little bit more gently than compression-only CPR. But certainly CPR will wake people up if they are just on the trajectory towards cardiac arrest. And we know that the delayed start of CPR is so dangerous. And early start of CPR in the patient not needing it is much less harmful than the delay.
That makes complete sense, the physical stimulation. Chest compressions are a very good physical stimulation.
I have to say hello and stroke their chin and gently stroke their shoulder.
Right,
first.
But it would seem from a chain of survival perspective, it would be even better if we had a real, easily publicly usable ventilation system. And giving them BVMs is not going to be, it's just way too skill intense. I could think of some things that would work, but I haven't seen anyone pushing this. I'd love to see the ability for the public to ventilate patients and have that as prevalent as external defibrillators. And yet I haven't seen any work on this. It would almost seem like you give them a clothespin, a medical version of it, so you'll charge $15 instead of 50 cents, and some tube that you could actually stick in the mouth and squeeze the mouth around it, much akin to the papers that have come out through the anesthesia literature of just putting an endotracheal tube into the mouth and ventilating through that. And that's been shown to be more effective than BVM masks. that would seem workable. You could easily just by pictures show people how to put a clip on the nose and then scrunch the lips around a tube, and you just need some kind of bellows to squeeze. What on this chain of survival, why is public ventilation not being pushed?
That's a very good question. It's definitely an important part of it in all resuscitation, and maybe in opioid overdoses in particular, especially with the little bit slower acting opioids like heroin and the methadones and things like that. I don't have a clear answer, and I'm not sure whether the lack of ventilation is a lack of skill and equipment or just people being nervous to do it by any means. It is difficult, but I think for the lay public, I think the biggest hurdle is I don't want to touch anything in their mouth, and this is really hard. And I haven't seen a device that adequately addresses that, people being scared of that.
All right. So if we're lacking that, so we're going to give early naloxone. Hopefully that's going to be around through the various channels that we've gotten this to the public. They're going to start CPR if the patient's unresponsive. What else on this chain of survival?
I think the next thing is when the emergency treatment gets there, I think we need to, first of all, quickly see who needs continued CPR. And if it's continued CPR, follow the ACLS algorithms without further ado. And I think we can talk about naloxone in that algorithm later, but it's certainly not the first point of call if it's on there at all. And providing that you get, I think my experience, both from the States being with the EMS there and in Norway, is again, we're too heavily reliant on naloxone. Because one thing is not to expect the lay people to be able to ventilate, but we should certainly be able to expect our EMS personnel to be able to ventilate with entitled CO2 and all of that, and for them then to start the ventilations. First of all, to allow whatever naloxone was given before time to work, and then secondly, to start breathing out the CO2 that's going to be such a problem for the patient when he or she wakes up anyway. And then once you have airway control, you can start titrating your naloxone. I advocate the intramuscular route. I think working on an IV line in someone with an A and B problem is not really part of it. And I think we have plenty of evidence that the intramuscular route works really quickly. And if you take the time to place a cannula into account, I think they're at least equivalent.
So maybe this is a good time to talk about it. So what are your feelings about naloxone during cardiac arrest? Just from a physiologic perspective, it would seem if we're ventilating, it obviates the need. And yet there's now this groundswell of idea that naloxone has some effects beyond simply starting the patient's breathing again. So what is your feelings of naloxone in cardiac arrest?
If there is a physiologic effect of naloxone in cardiac arrest, it is hitherto unknown. There's been important and exciting evidence or research coming out from Nathan Strong last year saying that they had an article about an association of early naloxone use with outcomes for non-shockable rhythms. And that was met with some enthusiasm. And the basic science behind that association, because that's what it is at best at the moment, is unknown. So that's certainly important for further research. But then there was Brian Grunow had a review out just after, which included this other study, says that there is no place for naloxone in cardiac arrest at the moment. And I find it difficult to say that some experimental association overshadows a good review from the group behind there that's been shown. And secondly, I'm doubtful because there's so much naloxone about. There's so many people receiving naloxone. So if it had a huge effect, you would see this isn't a natural experiment in a way, by filling this community with all this naloxone. So if it had a really important effect on cardiac arrest, I think you would have seen signals in different channels. So there's certainly exciting things there and big unknowns, but I find no reason at this point to change my practice by adding in an extra thing that will take priority over things that I know works. Because we've all been in cardiac arrest, and I think it's enough to do already. So we need to prioritize what the evidence suggests. And I don't think naloxone is there at the moment.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I think you've put your finger on what really needs to change in an opioid cardiac arrest, which is I think people give short shrift to the ventilations. And in some cases, in early hemodynamic cardiac arrest, that might make a little bit of sense. But in these patients in particular, end-tidal CO2 is absolutely required. And those breaths have to be getting in. And you cannot be half-assing the ventilatory side of the cardiac arrest. So now the patient is transported to the emergency department. They might be a cardiac arrest, they might not. Where in the chain of survival are the EDs falling short?
Well, first of all, this is probably one of the biggest differences between a cardiac arrest chain of survival and an opioid overdose chain of survival, because there's a big break in the chain here. In so many communities, I think both in Europe and in the States, people refuse transport to further care. People don't very often refuse transport to further care after a cardiac arrest and the return to spontaneous circulation. So this is a big difference. So I think bridging this gap is one of the most crucial or first steps for further care. First of all, you need to be organized so that EMS can be equipped to bypass the emergency department and move on to the chain locally if that's what they want or have to, and give people real chances, because there's no point to be transported to an ED if nothing's going to happen in that ED. So the innovative things in the States that they've started with, of course, is EMS initiating buprenorphine, which I've seen several examples of in the States. And I really hope the literature is going to, I think the literature is going to expand quite quickly on this because it's been rolled out many places. But I think first and foremost, as healthcare professionals, you need to be kind and first do no harm. And the other reason for that big break in the chain is too much naloxone and people being sent straight into withdrawal. And then we wonder about why they aren't very cooperative afterwards. But an over-antagonism, that's, in my mind, that's an avoidable harm. And we need to ask the question, why didn't you overdose yesterday? And why didn't you wait until tomorrow? What has happened in your life today? And I think that question gives a lot of surprising answers. It has to do with diet and concurrent physical illness. It has to do with the actual drug. It has a lot to do with people saying, actually, today was really bad because it's the anniversary of my mother's death, or whatever is going on in people's lives. But these are people at risk of overdose quite often every day. And they don't overdose every day. Like any other chronic illness, we have to address the causes why this acute exacerbation.
You say that, and it's so obvious, and I never asked that question in my entire clinical career, and that's baffling. So if people took nothing else from this podcast, that would be more than enough reason to have gotten value from it. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Obviously, if they are in a state of sadness or depression, hey folks, but you know we're not getting right to the show because you're listening to the free foam feed of EMCrit rather than the members only feed. Now, I'll put you out of your suspense. This is a full episode. You're not going to be cut off. Don't get upset that, you're hearing this and now 8 minutes from now, you're going to be listening, super excited by what you're learning, and then all of a sudden, and no more episode. You never want to hear that sound again. You're not going to hear it in this one, but you're going to hear it in a bunch of others because you're not a member. And membership is so cheap and so beneficial to the care that you could provide your critically ill patients in the ED or ICU that it's just crazy that you're still hearing this message. So go to emcrit.org/join, become a member, do it before the end of the year. You could write it off on your taxes. You could use your CME funds. And then all of a sudden you get all of the stuff that is not available in the free feed, and you never have to hear this message again. Please consider joining, and thank you for listening. Particularly this day, they might take a little bit more not to necessarily kill themselves simply because they want to dull the pain. What are some of the other reasons they might give as answers that we need to be aware of that will affect the clinical treatment of these patients?
I think that for the immediate treatment, I think the most important thing to find out is whether it's long-acting or not, because that's going to make a huge difference. You don't know the amount, and no one can say for sure what's in that bag of drugs anyway. But if you know that people have taken methadone or OxyContin or any other depot preparation of an opioid, that certainly should alert you to the fact that they will need longer observation times. And I think that comes true when we're going to talk about the Nitazenes later, because they also appear to have longer duration than the fentanyls typically do. So that's the first thing to avoid, to let people go either out from the ambulance or from your ED if you think there's long-acting opioids on board. And then secondly, we know that at least we know from Norway, and we've published on this, that people have bouts of overdoses. So we have no one dying within the first 24 hours after they've been treated by the ambulance, but lots of people die within the first week. So there are things going on in people's lives. And it's hard to vocalize that to a random ED doctor or ambulance worker. It's hard. So you need to really sit down and get trust from people. And this is back to the chain, because one of the reasons they don't care divulging these things, they've never experienced getting help from any of before anyway. These are people with plenty of experience in their life of rejection. There's no lack of that. And they get rejected from us all the time as well, de facto, because we don't really have anything to offer them. So hopefully, by starting looking at a chain like ours, will help both EMS personnel and doctors feel less compassion fatigue because they actually will have something to offer. Hopefully, this will also help patients in saying, yeah, there's a point of divulging my inner pain to you because I might get help.
That's such an important point. And it's really, I think most EDs, if trainees are just left to the natural evolution, will breed contempt for these patients. It's just, there's something about the environment of emergency medicine that will breed contempt. And compassion has to be an actively instilled value. You need a attending who is saying that these people deserve our empathy. Otherwise, I think we're just going to build continued generations that just are not regarding these people as people, but just as a really annoying patient presentation that we'd rather not show up. Let's swing back to a topic we were mentioning a few minutes ago, which is naloxone dosing. So what, if you had your druthers, you were writing the guidelines for the world, what would be the ladder of naloxone dosing?
First of all, the most important thing is that naloxone will always have to belong in a framework that does not start with naloxone. It starts with recognizing the symptoms. It starts with the physical stimulation. It starts with assessing whether or not this needs CPR, because that's going to be a big bifurcation in your road moving on. But if you're at the level where you think that this A is a potential opioid overdose, and B, it's not a cardiac arrest, and C, I managed to ventilate this patient, and I'm talking about the algorithm for healthcare personnel. For lay people, it's obviously going to be a little bit different. But if you're as a healthcare person, that's when you're going to start talking about giving the naloxone. And it will depend a little bit on what opioid is prevalent in your community at that time. If there's potent opioids, you certainly, like fentanyls, you probably need a little bit more naloxone to start with in a heroin area that we have in Europe. I don't know. It's always about titration anyway. And the average doses we would start with in Norway would be 0.4 to 0.8 milligrams intramuscularly, which is a lot smaller than what I think most American practitioners would use. And certainly with the products now being available in the States, being 5 milligrams IM or 10 milligrams intranasal coming in, you start having really high initial doses. And then if you give a few of those because you're nervous and you don't wait long enough, you're going to overshoot the mark by a magnitude compared to if you start a little bit less. So depending on your local opioid and your route of administration and ventilatory control, I would advocate below 2 milligrams as your first dose.
Yeah, it's funny. We have stocked the 0.4 milligram pre-made syringes in most of the EDs I'm at. And what I've always taught is just diluting that by a factor of 10. And now you have 0.04 milligrams per ml, and you have a 10 cc syringe of that. And you can give 1 or 2 cc's of that, give some time, and then go from there. That was really in the era of heroin. Would you advise going slightly higher in a place that has fentanyl prevalence?
If you're in the ED and you have an IV line, I think starting whether it's 0.04 or 0.1 or whatever, diluting it and giving it IV like that would be sensible. I think in the community or with EMS and in the ambulance service, I'd go for the intramuscular route. It's much quicker and it saves me a lot of effort, so I can actually focus on the airway. And I would start with, depending on your drug, but not more than 1 milligram, I think IM to start with.
Sure. Now, I think where people fall off some degree of sense is when that's not working, they tend to go really big. And I understand the inclination. What they want to do is just eliminate naloxone as a possible antidote. So they eventually, you want to get to big doses so they could just say, we failed naloxone, we have to go further. Either it's not a naloxone responsive drug or there's other co-adulterants on board. So what is your escalation? Let's say you had an IV, you're in the emergency department, you've given 0.08, 2 cc's of the diluted mix. How long are you going to wait? And then what's your next dosing?
If I give it IV, you don't have to wait that long, pending you have decent circulation. The IV, it penetrates the blood-brain barrier really quickly, but you also have to remember if you've actually ventilated them or they actually have a big CO2 narcosis on top of this. So it's all the modifiable reasons for unconsciousness in this patient, with opioids being one of them. So I would at least make sure I ventilated them long enough to eliminate that, both as a confounding factor and also because it's not nice to be woken up with a pH or whatever is 7.25 and is entitled CO2 of a lot. My dose escalation there, I'd wait 2 or 3 minutes even with the IV route and just do it by then. But then I think if you don't respond to, say, 2 milligrams maximum intravenous, I'd start thinking that maybe this isn't an opioid being the main culprit. And in the States, you have problems with the xylazine. You, of course, have all the benzodiazepines, alcohol. There's a lot of things going on. Plus, people that look like they use opioids also get diabetic coma and cerebral hemorrhage and whatnot.
Now, there are case reports, I think case series as well, of patients who have required higher doses than that of naloxone and have reversed. They still have the incredibly myotic pupils and they're still breathing at 2 times a minute, and you wind up giving them 5 and then 10 milligrams naloxone, they finally reverse.
Yeah.
Would you be doing that, or would you just ventilate and metabolize?
The thing is, if you have someone who's actually ingested a massive amount by accident, most likely that they took something from a bag that was supposed to be spread out over 4 blocks and took them themselves, you could envisage that case scenario. I think it'd be rare, and I don't know. I think the literature and the approval of the drug say that if it doesn't respond to about 10 milligrams of naloxone, think of another diagnosis. On the other part, I think if you have those massive fentanyl doses given to yourself IV, I would suspect you have quite a lot of these people who would get stiff chest, wooden chest syndrome, cardiovascular collapse, and die quite quickly and never come to the ED. And you see quite a lot of those fentanyl overdoses where there's big amounts of fentanyl in their post-mortem blood, but no fentanyl metabolites. So they died really quickly. And that's, in those cases, I don't think any naloxone can help you, even if you're there, because it's a different kind of death and a different kind of pathology at the really high doses. So I think there are cases where, and if you wake up after 10 milligrams of naloxone, you probably had lots of other things happening to you as well. So it's hard to.
Sure. Let me go back to something you mentioned a minute ago. In an ideal world, would the public comes across someone who has a suspected opioid overdose, they have naloxone available, they don't have the ability to check a pulse, they're not really medically savvy. Would you be advocating that they start CPR simultaneous to that naloxone administration?
I think that anyone unconscious and not breathing normally should have CPR.
So they're giving the naloxone and waiting, hoping not to do the CPR, and what you would have changed is just do both. Is that right?
Yeah, and because what we say that people who you think have opioid overdose should not be treated like everyone else. Everyone else lying in the street, unconscious and with abnormal breathing, the recommendation, I think, internationally is start CPR. And I don't know how many, and these are definitely people in high risk of being in either cardiac arrest or a peri-arrest situation where early CPR is vital. And we're trying to find in Norway now, also with the take on naloxone, to actually go back through autopsy samples and see if we find people with naloxone in their blood being dead, who then possibly would have had naloxone either too late or an inadequate dose and not CPR training or not alerting the EMS. And then, of course, take-home naloxone becomes a failure in that it, rather than providing life-saving treatment, removes evidence-based life-saving treatment for people in need and the very vulnerable patient groups, which we're not great at assessing the adverse events of our public health initiatives. But that's one that we definitely are afraid of in this case.
Yeah, no, I like that. That makes complete sense. So if you had to have the most bang for a buck for a public service message, it would be just do CPR and the naloxone, not give the naloxone and wait.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Because that's also just one message. Just saying everyone who lies down unconscious with abnormal breathing should have CPR.
Yep.
If you have naloxone, you may give it to them after you started the CPR.
No, I like that. That makes complete sense. All right. Anything else on the chain of survival? I guess what we haven't discussed is where you'd like the emergency department to be sending these patients, because right now we're just sending them home. I think we've made a nice change in that we would give them something like buprenorphine now that we wouldn't have 5 years ago, but we're not sending them anywhere for the most part.
First of all, before you send them somewhere, treat them nicely. These are people with, in the most cases, they've been through a life-threatening event on top of what is often very difficult life. So you really need to work hard on their dignity to build a rapport. And I think sending them somewhere would be very different in different localities. First of all, different patients, of course, need different things, but there would be harm reduction facilities, low threshold meeting place, addiction care, peer supported programs, all sorts of things that I think to have a really good community involvement between the addictions field and your local ED would be vital at this point.
I think Norway is more advanced on this than we are in the States in most places. I think you have more care for your opioid and addicted patients in general. But I would love to just be able to give a referral to group in the United States that would just do a lot of the screening for what is needed, whether it's psychological care, but we have nothing like that. So really, we're left with.
I think that's, as for all the ED doctors, we have to do the assessment ourselves to get the correct consult.
Yeah, which is really difficult, especially with the time stress that we're under.
Very. I think community involvement locally at this point is actually really important, because people are going to go out back into the community where both their risks are for further drug use, but also where the solutions for their overall predicament are. I think community involvement between local EDs, I saw some great things in Boston like that. There was a designated ambulance part called Squad 80 who had really good relationship to all the different low threshold facilities, methadone clinics and things like that, where people could be referred to afterwards. But it takes a lot for everyone in the ED to know about these initiatives, to be aware of, oh yeah, this place is good for you. Oh, you live in that part of the city. There's a great whatever there. So you can even envisage having user representatives or peers being employed in the ED who would have more feet on the ground.
All right. Anything else we should talk about on chain of survival?
Secondary prevention.
Okay.
Just saying that I think internationally, having an opioid overdose is one of the best predictors that you are at risk of further opioid overdoses. And having survived an opioid overdose is certainly a predictor of risk of later death from opioid overdose. And I think that's the last link, even before recovery, is secondary prevention. And I think the whole chain and everyone involved must realize that this is not just an acute respiratory arrest because of opioids. This is a big red flag planted in your forehead saying, I'm at risk of dying of opioid overdose. And I think unless we recognize this as not just a disease, but also a cardinal symptom that we should treat as other cardinal symptoms, I think that's a different way of changing our attitudes as well.
I like that from the recognition piece, but what do we do to prevent it? Okay, so we've recognized this is a red flag. What would you have us do?
I think the buprenorphine initiations shows promise. I think in recognizing to our patients that we see that they are in pain and that they have this risk, I think that's important. I think building strong communities and links between the EMS, the ED, and the community in this part. I think that too often the emergency departments exist like it's a planet of its own and people are just beamed in and out of it. And that's not the case at all. So I think that strengthening community bonds locally is really important as well.
All right. Anything else on chain of survival before we move on to nitazenes?
No, just saying that we were first to the press, and I'm excited to see people break it apart and modifying. But I think most people should agree that we need to start thinking more like this.
Absolutely. All right, fantastic. Let's talk about adulterants. So we used to have 20 years ago, it's just easy. It's just heroin. Nice, clean, wonderful heroin. Now it's different. You never know what you're going to get. And so maybe we'll first talk about fentanyl. So it makes complete economic sense why fentanyl took a prevalence. Instead of having to grow a huge field of poppies for the manufacture of heroin, now in a lab with very easy chemistry. You don't need to be a PhD in chemistry to do the work here. You could create vast quantities of fentanyl, easily smuggled in, easily broken, stepped on to make a vast array of heroin substitute. So we have a ton of fentanyl in the United States. Is there differences between how we should be treating these patients if we suspect or when we're a high prevalence area for fentanyl adulteration?
I think there's certainly, for the fentanyl analogs, it's a huge group of drugs and they are more potent than you described the situation. I think you need more naloxone than you do in heroin, but I don't think you need as much more than what is advocated by some. And I think there's evidence coming out from various places in the States, observational data saying that the naloxone dosing is not increased into the 5, 8, 10 milligram doses to reverse the normal fentanyl overdose. I think that's an important thing to realize. I'm afraid that people, both the regulatory authorities, like the Food and Drug Administration, the drug companies, and everyone else, they believe that people are not being able to give first aid. So they try to close the gap between reduced breathing and cardiac arrest with pharmacology alone. And I don't think that's possible, because the uptake, even through the nose or intramuscular, whatever, it's still going to be a few minutes. It's still going to, and especially in poor circulation. And I think if you give 100 milligram naloxone, if you're in a peri-arrest situation, that wouldn't make a big difference. That's, of course, an exaggeration. But my point is that this has to be followed by first aid as well. You need some more naloxone. You don't need 5, 8, 10 milligrams, but it needs to be more first aid. And I don't think you can compensate for the lack of first aid with more naloxone.
That makes sense. For the actual healthcare providers, are you increasing your first dose, or are you just relying on titration to eventually get you there? Are you giving?
I'm increasing their ventilatory training, because they need that for so many patients anyway.
But are you giving initial higher doses of naloxone in a suspected?
In Europe, Estonia has been singled out as a fentanyl center, and they use, rather than 0.8, maybe 1.2 or 1.6 milligrams naloxone.
So that is quite a bit higher than what we were talking about, starting with a heroin of 0.04.
But yeah, but it's a lot less than intranasal 8 milligrams.
Absolutely. Okay.
So I think it's important when we say high and low, what we're actually talking about.
Yep.
I think in today's world and in today's market, everything below 2 milligrams is low, because there are these really strong products out there.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. So you might start with 0.4 rather than 0.04. And you'd still be well below the higher levels, but still.
I think the advocates are really high doses. You quickly end up giving 10 milligrams, and suddenly you're at 20. Our discussion about 0.8 or 1.2 becomes irrelevant.
All right. And they shouldn't last particularly longer. Their metabolism is rapid.
No. Fentanyl has, I think there's been really good evidence over many years and from many places around the world that reintoxication is relatively rare, and it has been safe for treat and release, or whatever the policies have been called around, for both for heroin and also for fentanyl. Now, this is changing for the Nitazenes that we can talk about later.
That's what this was going to lead into, yes. Yeah, but let's stick with just a sec with the heroin and fentanyl. Generally, they're being watched 4 hours, which probably is a real excess of safety. I think you could probably get them out sooner. Yeah. And that's just what the EDs, we generally will tell patients, like I want to go home. And it's like, all right, you have 2 more hours left, wait around. If they want to sign out and it's been an hour, we generally feel pretty safe that they're not going to reintoxicate. Now, that all changes with these different adulterants. So why don't you introduce us to the nitazenes, and then we'll go from there.
So the nitazenes is a really interesting, and it's not a new group of opioids. It's classified as a novel psychoactive substance or a novel opioid. And they're old drugs tried out by the pharmaceutical industries in the 1950s. A big family of opioid drugs, benzomidazole drugs, that were abandoned by the pharmaceutical industry because of their poor therapeutic index. It was easy to overdose on them, so they left them. But they've now been taken up by, the guys who weren't able to make a fentanyl factory were able to make a nitazene factory, and there's been increased overdoses in Europe and in Australia. And we've just have a literature review, looking first and foremost on their pharmacology, showing where they are, and they're in general about as potent as fentanyls, 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin maybe. But I think the most worrying part from a clinical perspective is that many of them have active metabolites. Indeed, some have metabolites that are more potent than the mother compound.
That seems like a disaster waiting to happen.
So that changes. So in terms of naloxone reversal, from the evidence we have now, they require a little bit more than heroin. I think the median dose is 1.2 milligram. And that's from our review. And I think I've seen that in case series that's come out after our literature search from Isuardi Al and Robert Darrens and others in Australia. It's shown that there's a relatively moderate increase in naloxone use for the immediate dose, but there seems to be a higher proportion of patients who require naloxone infusion over 12 hours. That changes everything, in terms of treat and release and observation time if you're in a community where the nitazenes become prevalent.
100%. So you get a patient like this, you're in an area with high nitazene prevalence. What are you going to do clinically? How long should you be watching them to make sure they're not going to reintoxicate?
This is so new, so I'm not sure, because you don't know whether this is one of the nitazenes with active metabolites. And indeed, you have cases where people have been given the metabolite as their mother substance, in which case there are none. And it's a really complex pharmacology and chemistry behind here. But I think this definitely reiterates the need for comprehensive post-overdose care. Because since you don't know, there's no way you'll have, I can't envisage for a long time you'll have rapid tests telling you it's this, that, or the other. And they will only be able to qualify which drug it is, not quantify the amount. So the toxicology will not be helpful for a long time in the emergency setting. So I think it just highlights the need to have a comprehensive overdose response where people want to be observed and want to be cared for and feel that's useful so that you can start your post-overdose follow-up anyway. And if they become more drowsy or have reduced breathing, you can then start naloxone infusion if needed or repeated dosing. But I think this is really going to push the health service to have to take the post-overdose follow-up really much more serious than we have until now, because the danger of letting them go is going to be so much higher.
And when you say that, what you're really referring to is we have to start being nicer so that people don't want to sign out, so they'll actually stay for the observation and not just leave because they're fed up with the staff.
Yeah, I think we did that. We did years ago in Oslo. We were asking people why don't you want to come? And they asked a very pertinent question, because there's nothing there for me. And you can't really argue with people who quite rightly says that you're actually receiving no help there. You're receiving observation, and that's a little bit helpful, of course, but really trying to address real patient needs and think these are autonomous people. They have their right to decide or not. And it's going to be really complex discussions about patient autonomy if we're going to start using force here. And I don't think that's feasible at all.
Yeah, I've been in the circumstances numerous times where you are actually worried about a patient. You might have had to give them multiple doses of naloxone. They might even be on a drip, and now they want to sign out. And that's a risky circumstance. And yet, I think the feelings of the courts and my own libertarian streak is they have the right to do it as long as they've been adequately informed. But with the nitazenes, we could see a lot more patients dying than were happening with heroin alone. I know you don't have exact answers, but we do need some guidance because we might be experiencing this tomorrow on shift. So what is a safe amount of time to observe these patients if you truly suspect some form of nitazene adulteration?
It's early to say because there's been some case series in our review. It seems that 12 hours is a number that's come up in a number of those settings.
Oh, that seems disastrous.
Yeah, and then you have things coming in, and this is, of course, where some people start advocating nalmefene.
Yes, I wanted to talk about that, so tell me.
That's an opioid antagonist, and I'm not sure how old it is. It's been around for a long time, but it's come back into vogue in that it has a much longer half-life than naloxone, and it can be postulated that it will therefore protect against long-acting opioids, and I guess it will in terms of the respiratory things. It remains to be seen whether it will also elicit awful withdrawal states in all the others that will lead to risky drug taking and all sorts of problems down the line. And I'm certainly hopeful that we don't get nalmefene approved or widely used without clinical trials.
I hear you.
This is definitely where, when we started with the opioid crisis, there were assumptions made about the pharmacokinetics in healthy volunteers and the use in clinical practice. And I think they're being challenged at the moment, where we see that there is evidence that there is a drug-to-drug interaction between opioids and naloxone that has effects on patients. And if we're going to start a whole new antagonist now, I really hope that we, as a community and the regulatory authorities, realize that this needs good clinical trials in real patients, not just approval because it might be safer.
I hear it. Would a strategy of giving them nalmefene and then some boop to take with them if they do have a precipitate withdrawal. Would that be a reasonable strategy until these studies are done?
I don't know, mixing buprenorphine and nalmefene with active metabolites you're getting into really complex receptor pharmacokinetics and dynamics here that certainly needs good studying to evaluate both the safety in terms of actually protecting against an overdose, if that's what you want, and also the safety in terms of the withdrawal and what kind of withdrawal behaviors you get into. It seems like my feeling, and I'm probably wrong on this, but that you start mixing a lot of things into your pot at the same time, just hoping it's going to be better.
I hear it. Is there anything we missed that you wanted to discuss?
No, I think the important part is realizing that opioid overdoses is a symptom of something going on in someone's life. And I think I'll reiterate my question about asking people, why didn't you overdose yesterday? And why didn't you wait until tomorrow?
Yep. No, I think that's fantastic. All right, I can't thank you enough. This has been incredibly educational, and I think it could save some lives. It might not be
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Remember what we talked about at the very top of the show? If you're interested in the Awake and Aware Conference, Scottsdale, Arizona, February 2027, then just come to awakeawareconference.com. Check it out. Take a look. awakeawareconference.com. Bye. Oh, do I hate that sound? I know you hate that sound, but that is the sound you hear at the end of a paid episode in which you only get partial content. And that's because you're not a member of EMCrit. You are not an EMCritter, which means you're not getting all of the up-to-date critical information to help your super sick patients. Whether you're in the ED, ICU, or the pre-hospital environment, EMCrit will help you take care of your patients better. It's cheap, it's tax deductible, or you could get it reimbursed on your CME, and you're part of something bigger than just this content. You're part of the team. And we're going to have so much incredible stuff coming out in the next year. New things, new episodes, new forms of education, and you're not going to want to miss out on it. And while there is a ton of foam, there's a bunch of stuff that is behind the paywall. So please, please consider joining. Just come to emcrit.org/join. It takes 2 seconds, and then you will never have to hear this message again. But more importantly, you will be getting the cutting edge information to take care of your super sick patients. Scott Weingart for the EMCrit podcast saying bye-bye, and please come on over to emcrit.org/join.